artist Margaret Bowland today. I would like to talk to her a little bit about the meat and potatoes of your work. What I think is really interesting at Seton Gallery right now is that we have 10 paintings that are very realistic, they're very lifelike, and they also tell a narrative that deals with a lot of complicated social issues. And I feel like you're celebrating a lot of the issues and you're also revealing them. Mm-hmm. So I want to really get into how you go about choosing the right model. Do you see yourself as casting the right individual to sit for you?
That's an interesting question, because the ideas, the paintings themselves, come from the people first. Mm-hmm. I don't have an idea. Well, in the Olympia paintings I did, I had an idea about wanting to recast that Manet and work with it. And the young woman who plays is the African-American girl in that painting, was 16 years old when I met her through a friend, and she just showed up.
Oh, nice.
I was just lucky.
Nice.
And after that, she started bringing her niece with her because she was babysitting her, and that was JJ. So and frankly, the painting ideas, all of them that have to do with Jay, came after I met her, and they were about her.
Oh, wow.
And I find that now, I have an idea for a painting, but invariably once the models come into the room, it changes. And it starts to go after them.
Do you feel like you elicit something in them, or are they very generous?
No, I feel like I'm hanging on.
Oh, nice.
I feel like they are. Jay is small for her age, but she is one of these people that's naturally regal. Mm-hmm. She's naturally aristocratic, and she just commands space she's in, and you're just lucky to be there. Mm-hmm. So I feel that way about the models I work with. I tend to go back to the same people over and over because they have a magnetism for me. But the painting's about them. And I look at one of the upsetting things about painting people who are sitting in front of you, like you are in front of me. When the light hits you, it's incredibly beautiful. And you know you're on a losing game. You can't possibly give back to the viewers what you actually are seeing. But you try. And for that scramble, you're obsessed with it. One is obsessed with it. So you scramble to make that happen. But it's always an understanding that you're not going to pull it off.
And how, for one painting, how many times do those models sit for you?
Depends. One painting in the show is done in 10 days. Another time, the ones where she was just standing. The other times they'll take a month to. Actually, one I'm working on right now is longer than that, because little kids especially, they believe they're posing for you if they're in the room. Wow. So I play cartoons, I do use photographs, but I can't ever get from a photograph what I really need. So I always invariably have to have them back in the room.
And so describe what these sessions are like. You mentioned that you play cartoons.
We do.
Do you feel like you're...
Jay and I literally played when she was first... the makeup started with... I started putting it on in the Olympia series to talk about trying to protect yourself with a mask. In that series of paintings, I saw the two... women as fellow people in a foxhole. I mean, when Manet shows you that Olympia painting, he's got you in the position of the John. And Olympia meant whore. I didn't know that. I thought it was literally the girl's name. It wasn't. So you're basically a John in a room looking at these women. And I was always overwhelmed by the fact that the African-American woman is the one dressed holding the flowers. She's actually much more protected than the Caucasian woman in the foreground. And I started to see these women as interchangeable, and both as victims, but at the same time, they were triumphing over the scenario in which they were placed because of their relationship to each other. Not homosexual per se, but, or perhaps if you wish, but just as a respect for each other. Often like a waitress for many years, if you're in a team You become part of that team against the oppressor or against the, in our case, it was the customers.
Yeah.
And I saw these two women as becoming compatriots. And then the one you've got up where one woman is applying blue paint to the African American girl, I saw that as a way that she was protecting her by turning her into an actress. So she did not have to be the person the man was looking at. She was simply acting as the person.
That's really interesting. That painting strikes me on so many levels, and my first response was, as a viewer, that I was interrupting the act of painting and being painted, and I thought about you as the artist and the sacred act of painting and what it means to have someone observing you.
Wow, that's cool. I did not think of that before, but I like that very much.
And do you think, as a viewer, are you inviting the viewer to be a participant on some level or to join the group? Is the viewer protected, or is the viewer the one that's actually creating or bringing harm to the situation or bringing a set of baggage?
I would say yes, to harm. There are paintings, and we talk about this when I teach, point of view and what's actually going on. Who's assigned what. And in those paintings, it's funny, maybe in all of my paintings, is that true? In all of my paintings, something's going wrong. And the viewer is, what I want to have happen is for the viewer to see something going wrong, but that the person in the painting who's actually looking back out at you is better than what's happening to them, is triumphing over what is happening to them, is more beautiful than what the world has constructed for them. So you're as the viewer, you're both bringing the harm into the room, but I'm hoping that you are seduced by the beauty enough to see what's going wrong, but also to see its healing. In the fact that the person is still there, still themselves, quite individually, and is still beautiful.
There was an interview that I read recently with you for High Fructose, where you mentioned that you're interested in beauty when it falls from grace, but when it carries damage, that's when it's a problem or the problem's revealed. And I was wondering, especially in looking at the young girls who seem very aware of themselves, a little self-conscious, but also are playing a trick with the viewer or showing the viewer sort of a seductive side. That's not disturbing. In my mind, it's more about testing limits and boundaries.
That would be true.
And the thing I was wondering is there a point when one's insecurities are more innocent and a point where those insecurities get taken too far where it creates damage? Do you think that there is a pivotal point in one's life, maybe developmentally, where you're aware of social issues, but you're playing with those limits?
Siri Hoosfate wrote the essay to my first catalog show, and she wrote about the fact that there's a time, Freud talks about the time in young girls' lives. I hadn't ever really honestly thought about it, but the exact year, but that 6 and 7 is a time right before one becomes aware of being seductive, of having sexual reality. And I think of it as a kind of paradise. I remember very clearly the moment where I was told, don't do that, you're a girl, not a boy. I was the eldest, had a large amount of cousins, and we played together, did a lot of plays together, and I remember the horror of it, the absolute horror of it, when my mother said, no, don't. You're showing up the boys. And I have talked to friends who are African American, and they have similar memories of that moment where they realized that they were other. Same, I have friends who are gay, same kind of thing, and certainly women. And I've got a girlfriend who's African American, and a girlfriend, and she laughs about which was worse. But in carrying damage, I guess what I mean by the word damage is also consciousness. I don't think we all know this. It's a cliche that suffering creates. a depth of character, and I have a tendency to go to hell with that, because there's nothing wonderful about suffering. It's just suffering, for God's sakes, and one would wish to avoid it. But insofar as one is aware of suffering, whether you're going through it or not, I think that there is a deepening of one's awareness of being on this world. And the more privileged a person is, maybe they don't escape this awareness, but it gets kicked down the road a little bit. And I'm working with children to find out where that tripwire is. When does it happen? When does it occur? And right now I'm working with 4-year-olds, and they are fabulous because they're totally unaware of any. It's in some ways it's heartbreaking, because you're looking at paradise before the fall.
Oh,
you know.
Yeah.
They have no understanding that awful things are ahead, and I'm both mesmerized by it. And I use them. I use them to get for you to try to see. There are so many things that you say you wish to protect in this world, and you're not protecting them.
Sure. So in a way, it's as if the viewer is actually confronting this gaze, which is that of seduction and play, and just really testing of all sorts of boundaries, and also just a flirtatious look. The viewer is the one that's reminding this subject of social standing, race,
and what they take from it. I mean, I get in a lot of trouble, obviously. I mean, I had a lot of pain when I was your age, coming into the art world, where art was supposed to be about art, and that very narcissism just broke my heart, because art had been a language through which people talked about very important things. It was an act of seduction. I always tell my students, art must be an act of seduction, so the person, you can literally hold them in the room, but you want it to be a seduction that is toward some idea or feeling, or toward something, for God's sakes, not just seduction for the sake of seduction. And the world in which we find ourselves, art is, it's often a bit of a void. And making paintings, period, right now is somewhat suspect, but making paintings that have an intention is even more difficult to put over, in effect.
Sure. And I was going to ask you about that. Do you think that in some way, being an artist, specifically a painter, that there is some, I guess, driving force or urge to place yourself in art history and let everyone know who you're speaking to? Is that how you felt when you approached the Olympia series, that you wanted to really tackle Manet's vision? And also, coincidentally, you're referencing Titian and Giorgione, and going all the way back to the 16th century. And how do you...
Watteau. Here's what I know you're not supposed to say that. I know it's considered a lot of chutzpah, but here's the point that I don't understand. I know a lot more writers than I know painters, because frankly, I find them more. I find them more interesting. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But they are always they consider a work worthy or not, in terms of how much they've immersed it in history. Not literally, I mean, the history of the world or history of literature, but insofar as a person has inculcated the history, their language, and understands how to speak. And they're constantly, their criticism is running down the novel and looking basically at references that, okay, this guy brought Titian into the room. That's a big guy. What did he make it or not? Did he stand up to that or not? In art, and we're all getting ready to go to the art fair, Miami Basel, right? You haven't got a clue. You know, when you go into these rooms, about what what the point of judgment is, what you're being asked to appreciate. And I'll admit, I tend to just sort of close down. To be honest, I teach from literature and movies. I give a lot of movies as homework, because that's an art form kids understand.
Sure.
And I'll start to talk to them about, for example, since they don't know anything about composition, I'll say, okay, George Clooney's the star of this movie. He's not on the front page. He's not in the first opening seconds. The guy's leading you in that finale, and bam, suddenly you got George Clooney. So there's a weave.
Okay.
And then I start to talk to them about pacing, lighting, etc.
Yep.
Movies they understand. Painting, they haven't got a clue. They go into, I always feel about people walking into museums as if they walk into a library and just can see the backs of the books, can just read they can see that it's a beautiful pattern, but they can't read. They can't enter any of the books. And it's because of, art committed suicide. It's a lot of political reasons, for God's sakes. I mean World War II, for God's sakes. But that's what we're left with.
Yep. So are you saying that you feel, or at least your biggest complaint with some contemporary artists is that they set up a conceptual wall with art history?
Conceptual art, I mean, the whole, I'm sorry, but one of the things I smile about kids, the same avant-garde was there when I was your age.
Yep.
The avant is now the garde. There isn't an avant-garde. It's just, I mean, the found urinals, the found object, Michigas, you get this stuff. I've now just seen it recycle, but it's new to the young, to somebody who's never seen it before. Because I had a friend, a lovely man I adore, say to me, I know everything about art. And I said, really, Bob? He said, yes, everything since the 60s. And I thought, wow. There's not film, literature, nobody would say, I know everything about filmmaking, and they know everything about filmmaking from 1960.
Yeah.
No. But that is a perfectly reasonable position in my world. But there we are.
Yeah. Very good. I think it's interesting how you described the viewing of your paintings, that you lead people in, and also your approach to art history, where something has to grab you and you have to feel gripped by that gaze. And then you can look at the social issues or what's being revealed.
I talked to them about the flaying of Marcius. Okay, one of the things I said in the history of art was about showing you awful stuff, but getting you to stand there. I mean, I try to point out to them that earliest art was the way the church taught or indoctrinated its people. They were illiterate. So you'd go into the church and have this experience with the art, and therefore literally knew the stories from that. But the guy had to make it beautiful. You were talking about beheadings, crucifixions, endless murder. So you had to, in order to hold them, you had to make it beautiful. And also in that paradox, you have power. I think now we're so numbed by looking at horrible footage on television, on YouTube. We can't take it anymore. It's just too awful. Places that we know about where all hell's breaking loose and we can't do anything about it, or we're not. And I think that people do wall up. But what the ancients knew is if you show them that they're hungry for something to go on, and it's a beat later that they find out whether it's a good or a bad thing, then in that moment they've also made a judgment and also asked themselves a few questions.
Sure.
And I'm just trying to hold on to that tradition or stay within it.
Sure.
That's all.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about, and these are other areas where I feel like my attention is really held in the paintings, and then actually there were a lot of things that took me days to read and understand. And what I really enjoy also is that there are blown up candies, there are money flowers, there are wigs falling off, there are moments of paint that travel all over the canvas. Literally the makeup is coming off on the models and coming off on the sheets. And I was wondering, and also the wedding cake, and that very delicate moment between a woman that's either married or of marrying age and a young girl who's really trying to follow in her footsteps, where there's a natural curiosity. And I was wondering if you think of these moments as abstractions, because they are representational, but they're also, the scale has shifted in the paintings, and how if you have some of those props around, or if they're things that you have sort of invented and also exaggerated.
Well, all of that is true. I mean, I came to Chapel, I went to college in 1971, and it was a fascistic atmosphere, really. There was the understanding you could not paint the figure. So I became an abstract painter because when that was the only education, formal education I have is as an abstract painter. And I found it to be incredibly useful and helpful. It's the way I teach my kids. Basically, because all painting is basically you're just painting light. So you're just painting light as it plays over surfaces or as it comes to your head. So to get a composition, some sort of balance between light and dark and middle tones is certainly an abstract concept. And it was an abstract concept to Giotto.
Yeah.
But they simply weren't parted in the old days. Gosh, I hate thinking about it as the old days, but I guess that is true. But they weren't separated, as they are not now on film. I mean, the lighting is not taught in art schools, but it's one of the first things taught in film school.
Yeah, interesting. So do you think that following today's model of contemporary artists, do you think that it's important to actually borrow from multiple fields? Like,
yeah.
You should take a film class, you should take a painting class.
Oh, yeah. And nobody does. That's funny, I was recently talking to people about the BFA. It used to be that you went to a liberal arts college and you majored in art.
Sure.
But you also, were studying literature, French, at the same time, economics. God help me, I remember I got destroyed at Chapel Hill over the statistics course. I'll never forget. It's just a horror show. The word now makes you break out in hives. But it was the intention of the university to do so, but you were batted about. And you didn't know what to think one day to the next, and you're finding out something in French about Joan of Arc, and then you see a painting about Joan of Arc. And find about something about French and the communication, the level of communication of French at that time. All of that stuff changes you. And now I'm afraid that art schools will tend to, they'll take out all the stuff you don't like and just sort of give you what you feel like doing. I don't really think it's a good plan. I mean, it's not a good way to parent.
Are you saying that artists need to be broken before they can pick up all the pieces?
No, I don't think they need to be broken at all. But I think we're broken at 12, and the rest of our lives is an attempt to piece ourselves back together. No, I mean that I think that people should be shown as much as possible.
Sure.
There are a lot of doors. I think my mother talks about the fact that when I'm from a small town, and it used to be that if you were a good carpenter, if you were a good farmer, you could have a lot of different skills and still be considered a successful person. Now our world's got to be to the place where the doors are getting fewer and fewer. So the skill sets are not being recognized by a large amount of people, and I think that's also true of intellectual capacity. And you want to open as many doors as possible. You certainly don't want to close them, and certainly not to young people.
Yeah.
And I worry that my son, I would come back to him about, he pitches reality shows, and I would say, well, do one about art galleries. He says, Mom, they already did a show about art. Nobody cared. It died in a minute because art's just written off. And I thought, wow, that is true. And we've written ourselves off.
Yeah.
But, wow.
That show, I think it was called
Sarah
Untitled.
Jessica Parker was doing it. They did all the things right. My son says, if you have to pay for talent, it's going to be a harder thing to make it work, because reality shows, they're just money. They're just banks of money. But they had to pay for talent. But he said even then they got nobody watched. I thought, wow. But everybody watched. Everybody loves the one
Project Runway.
Project Runway, absolutely. And why? Because the skill set.
Exactly.
Who in the hell can make a suit in 7 hours?
Exactly. Yeah.
And you're just mesmerized by that thing. I love that show. But there's not. Nobody is composing and creating a painting in any kind of time frame.
Well, it's interesting because if the challenge for the week was to make a painting that would be 8 feet tall,
itself, yeah.
You would have a lot of hours that would just be about process, and I guess how would you show that, in a way that would be dramatic and gripping?
If somebody were actually, my son and I have talked about it, imagine, especially if it's a team, say even if you've got 3 minutes off each kid, you've got a show. I mean, if you bring it to the finale. But the problem is, though, that no one has an appreciation. We all appreciate the fact somebody can make a dress. We all have an understanding. Also, the public is denigrated incredibly by the art world, as you know. I mean, they're literally despised. So nobody has an interest in communicating. Well, you're not gonna. I mean, the very fact of its exclusivity and the fact that you're in some insider class or room is its value, its singular value. If Larry Gagosian tells you that's worth $75,000, it is.
Yep.
And the fact that the folks in Peoria find that silly, well, is it them or us?
Yeah.
So it gets a little
hairy.
Strange.
Yeah.
Yeah, it gets very strange.
Yeah. And I want to ask you, at what point in your career did you become represented, and did that change your work, or did it allow you to have a narrow focus, or how would you describe your process changing?
Being represented by a good dealer is like being handed a hand in an ocean when you are drowning. I painted for years, showing varied bits and places. It's everything. To believe that somebody, I always think of it, there's a famous book I think about all the time by Bernard Malamud called The Prisoner. And a man is being imprisoned, and he has no idea of how long he's imprisoned, what his offense was. And he develops a relationship with somebody on the outside by knocking on the wall. And it keeps him sane, it keeps him from going over the edge. A dealer is somebody knocking on the other side of that wall.
Yep.
And it's huge.
So
it's a terrible thing to say, because the percentages, people who work and work and work and work without representation, it's friggin' admirable. It really is.
Yep. So for you, was it that moment of instant validation?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Also, the man who represents me has a PhD in art history.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, it's pretty large. He knows when he's looking at the paintings what I put there. I mean, the odds. What are the odds?
Wow.
It was an incredible piece of luck. A man named Tom Styron. I was desperate, and I put an ad in Art in America, in the back of Art in America in the summer, for $350. You can put a 1x2-inch picture in of your work. I put one of the paintings that you've got in, the one of Wedding Cake.
Oh, wow.
And Tom Styron called me on the phone in July from Greenville, South Carolina. He's the head of the museum there. And said, I'm looking at this Art in America and thinking, these poor suckers. And he says, probably nothing good ever happens to these people. And then he said, but I find myself calling you.
Oh, wow.
And he put me in touch with a dealer. So in one phone call, one man, changed everything.
Wow. So I know that sometimes, especially students of mine have complained when they walk into a gallery that it's like they hit a brick wall, a very clean white brick wall.
Quite right.
And, sometimes you're talking to a receptionist, sometimes you're talking to the owner. You don't really know. Usually you can kind of tell based on a persona. But, a lot of galleries list that they don't take unsolicited
Nobody does.
Material.
Yeah.
So what would you say to an artist who is trying to cut through?
Well, my own dealer, this is something that I find, I say to my students, my own dealer told me that if I had brought my work in, he wouldn't have taken me. So that is, wow. I once was so upset. I was taking my work around to galleries in Chelsea. I was so hurt by what the dealer said to me. And I had to walk out through a room full of all these other people that were there to be seen by this dealer, and they had heard everything he said to me, that I left my purse and didn't go back. In New York City, that means you have to go back to the DMV. And anybody in New York City understands the weight of that statement. But rather than go back to that gallery, I would have done, no, it wasn't worth it. I ended up going, all my credit, everything over again. It was so horrible.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did that give you momentum, though? Did it?
Nope.
No.
One time, when I got a critique from a couple of critiques from famous dealers, shut me down for 6 weeks. It feels like you're not communicating. Nobody gets it, or if they get it, they despise it. I mean, what I do, I mean, they call it, what do they call it? Edgy, and also is the word is difficult. Difficult. I always think to myself, when was the point of art to be easy? But the truth is, I had a dealer say very honestly to me, he said what people want, he said Americans especially, they want the elevator's doors to open onto their apartment, and they want you to see a painting in the back of that wall that says that they're rich and they're with it. They don't want to talk about the work. And he said Warhol, for example, is the perfect artist for that. Reads from a long view away, and especially if it's a portrait of you that's sort of fuzzed out, you know, like Warhol did some wonderful things, don't get me wrong, but that's a very narrow place for marketing, to be that person. And they don't, and nobody wants their art to bother their guests. Of course. And I bother people.
I think it's great that you bother people.
Thank you. But
you're bringing up a lot of really complex issues that we all appreciate, and in a way that's very celebratory. I feel that.
I hope
that the subjects feel the confidence that you want them to feel. Yeah,
they do.
Yeah.
I had Jay told me that one of the she was little, but there was an article about my work in the Daily News in New York, but none of my friends, you know, look at the Daily News, so nobody saw it. But at Jay's school, the principal had an assembly. She was brought up in front of the whole school, and it was celebrated. It was huge. It was a very, very big deal.
Wow.
And it's, you know, I want to say this. I don't think that the general public understands. I don't set out to make difficult paintings. I don't think that there's as much free will as people assume. I'm obsessed by something. I have to see it and I make it. But I don't sit in, I mean, Lord, if I were figuring out what to make in some sort of calculated fashion, I would not do what I do, you know.
Yeah.
I think a lot of artists are like that, and people don't understand the fact that they don't have as much choices as you assume.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And thank you for spending the time to look at the work. It means everything. Thank you very much.
It means everything to have your work up at Seton. Thank you.
Thank you both.